Aging and disability services, behavioral health, and direct care and treatment. The Human Services Policy Bill details the changes made to all of those subject areas this session. Joining me now is Republican Senator Jim Abeler, who says the changes impact more than just policy, they impact people. Senator, welcome back.
Well, good to be here on a rainy day in Minnesota.
Yeah, it's not raining in here. It's the best we can do.
There you go.
All right, Senator, there was a lot of concern early on in the session of how the state's budget woes would impact human services. Now that the services policy bill has been approved by the governor, how did we do? Were those concerns founded?
Well, there's two bills, actually. There's the policy bill, which was pretty well worked out. It wasn't very controversial with Senator Hoffman and Senators Neuer and Schumacher and myself. But then there's the budget bill, where they asked us to reduce spending in human services by $1.09 billion, which actually is the largest reduction ever. We did a similar one in 2011 of about $1 billion. And so it was very difficult. And a lot of us felt that was a disproportionate share to put on this arena. But nonetheless, that's what the decision was. And we worked really hard together to put together a budget bill that will at least do the least amount of harm to the least amount of people. It was very hard.
Well, and Senator, you've long been an ally for people who rely on disability services. So, knowing that there was such hard work ahead, how did it feel being their voice at the table?
Yeah, and so somebody asked me that. Do you listen to the lobbyists and with their concerns? Actually, I listen to my own head because I've been in office 26 years and the people keep sending me back, so thank you for that. But it's a privilege and a great responsibility in times like this. It takes everything I know to try to come up with a really fair plan that can actually work. The governor's initial budget was in the same range as this final number that we came up with, but he had some very serious cuts to nursing homes, some very serious cuts to programming that would happen right away, and even taking money, reducing budgets of some of the service places. And there was a giant county share, which would have been a big property tax increase. And so I thought that was a really bad idea. And so working with Senator Hoffman and Representatives Neuer and Schumacher, we grittingly, hard fought, came up with a plan that actually doesn't cut anything, but just changes the trajectory of growth, like in the future, which was much softer on the individuals who could have come to great harm.
Yeah, speaking of your colleague, Senator Hoffman, he said the bill is flexible, it focuses on program integrity and efficiency, there's modernization in there, and it expands substance use disorder treatment options. So that's how he summarized it. How do you summarize it?
Well, that's fair. It's definitely retrenchment. And so when, in most cases, the money that we have is doubled by the federal government, which, by the way, has tons of money. I mean, $36 trillion in debt. Not to worry. Like, holy cow. I was worried when it was $10 trillion, but 36. We pay $1 trillion a year in interest. You know that? Anyway, so with the federal funding, the $1.09 billion becomes $2 billion of impact on the industry. So it's not inconsequential at all. But so we were able to limit the growth. That was the great compromise in both nursing homes and in the disability waivers to the CPI, the urban version, with a cap of 4%. And that's as deep as I'll get in the weeds for your viewers. But that's significant, but that actually generated about $900 million of savings, $1.8 billion impact on the industry for future monies coming to them. But hopefully they can work around that and not cause anybody any harm. But there's no cuts off of what they were getting. Nobody's money is going down, which it would have been in the bills that were brought to us from both the House and the governor.
I was going to ask about protecting taxpayer dollars. Senator Rasmussen said that this protects taxpayer dollars, which, as we know, is incredibly important at this time when the state has such budget constraints. So talk to me a little bit more about how the bill manages to do that. Well,
one thing it does is there's no county shifts. So the governor had $460 million in shifts to the counties, like a direct, like they can pay instead of the state. And the House had $580 million, which would have caused one of the largest property tax increases in this area, like in the history of time. And the Senate had 192 million. But I was able to work out some creative ways that maybe I'll get into to actually get rid of even that. But a shift to a county is a property tax increase. And it doesn't serve people any better, but it puts people, seniors and people with disabilities and just regular working families at risk to even lose their house because they can't afford their property taxes. So it does that. It also lowers the trajectory of spending by that $1 billion, 90 million over the 4 years. But to be cautious, you don't want to reduce your gas bill so much your house is cold. You don't want to reduce the spending on your health insurance that you have no insurance and that you can't afford to go to the doctor. So there's a balance. If you go too deeply, the people with disabilities and the frail elderly could actually die. And so that weighed heavily on Senator Hoffman and on myself, both in 2011 with that big deficit and now as we faced a very similar problem to fix. So I'm happy to say that no one's going to come to harm as a result of our bill, and that's not easy to say, and we succeeded in that, so I was feeling pretty good about that.
Yeah, that sounds like a success. You seem very somber about the bill, but no harm to people, no cuts, that's something to celebrate, right?
Yes. And we could spend quite a bit of time, like, how did we get here in the first place? Maybe we shouldn't have spent all the $18 billion, and that could have been spent better, and it's hard to get that out of my head because a lot of this was unnecessary. The needs of the people with disabilities and seniors haven't changed. There is a chance to do some reforms, and in the bill, in a few ways, we're going to kind of tighten up on people getting in programs that maybe should be in a different, less expensive program, or they'll be served well. So, all in all, it will protect the people to the best we can, and I'm happy about that part.
Okay. When I was looking at the Senate's bill side by side with the House's bill, I noticed that there were big differences on certain pages, extensive differences. So could you talk to me about some of those major differences between the bills and how they were resolved?
Yeah, and I'm trying to stay positive on all this stuff. The governor had a hard time putting a bill together to do what he had to do. With $460 million in shifts to the counties, that's just a way to balance the spreadsheet. I don't think they really wanted to do that, and it's a terrible idea. There are also some ideas where they would cut the funding right away, which is really not a good idea. And so I think that he mentioned something about, well, this is to get the discussion going, and so I took him seriously at that. One thing that we did in the Senate that made this work a lot better is I created some contingent rate cuts. We're creating a task force to sit down with 30 people who know this topic really well, parents, providers, some advocates, clients, to how can we manage this? And so if they have to find $45 million, they have to find $90 million a year in some savings. Instead of just doing the savings right now, we are going to let them work on it a bit more and come up with a thoughtful way. We had a bunch of ideas about how to save money, and we didn't like a lot of them. They may have to come back to some of those, but at least they'll be done in a more open process. And so that's going to be a 3-year group, and they're going to work together and bring back some recommendations as soon as next year. One thing that happens in conference committees is bad ideas don't get vetted very well. Like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And then you put it into law and some things happen that aren't very good. One thing that came out of the conference committee in 2023 was reducing the rates of family foster care to a new system and affecting something called disproportionate share, which is where assisted livings, they take a lot of elderly waiver people in. We give them a little bonus because thank you for taking those people that are reliant on it, because we don't pay quite as well as the private sector. And so those are two ideas we had to kind of undo in this process. But that's why you don't want to think of a lot of savings ideas you just kind of conjure up at this point. And so this task force is going to work at it. That itself will be interesting to follow, I think, for your listeners and for yourself. I'm excited about how that can actually maybe make the system work even better with a little less money.
Yeah, and it buys you time to see what happens with the economy. I think that's a really smart play.
Yeah.
House File 2115, the Human Services Policy Bill, had one of the best final votes I've seen for an omnibus bill this session. There were 55 votes in favor and 8 votes against. Did those numbers surprise you? And did you have to do any extra work across the aisle to achieve that?
You know, the funny thing, if you do a good job on the work, if you include people, you get a good product. With all respect to my Senate colleagues, they've had a hard time figuring out how to work together with us. As I've traveled the state for various campaigns and so on, you know what people want? Work together and get things done. They don't even always know the details, but they want us to work together. They figure we're here, we know some of the concepts, and could you work together? And I don't know why it's rocket science. And so if you look at some of the bills that are still stalled, or some of the ones that are having trouble passing, it's because they didn't work with us. Like, we're just that hard to work with. And actually, we were waiting. And so to credit Senator Hoffman and Representative Nur and Schumacher, they included all the conferees. The same way that there were conferees and others were included on the policy bill. That's how you do it. And so my commitment and Senator Hoffman's ongoing commitment is human services should not be political. It should be about the people. How do you solve their needs? You know, it's not in the Constitution. The Constitution calls for education, public safety, and roads, transportation. But this is like a cultural compact, like a social contract to look after seniors, the frail elderly, people with disabilities, and really care. We pay a lot of money for it. And the governor said, boy, they sure are expensive. I would say they sure are valuable. We better find a way to look after them in the best way. And I think this bill continues that effort. But I think, back to your question, if you work together, there's good ideas from all the sides. And instead of one side having ideas that are just not really good ideas, the other side, you work in the middle, between the 40-yard lines in a football metaphor. And so where people are generally comfortable with what goes on, and you stay away from the red zone, or the blue zone, which is what it's been lately. And so I think this bill and the one before it, the policy bill, is evidence of that.
Well, if we're going to stick with your football metaphor, we know that we're halfway through the game, right? So when we pick back up in February, is there anything that you had wished had been included that wasn't, that you still have hope of passing?
Well, I'm more nervous. We didn't solve all the deficit. And routinely, when there's a deficit, they go like, oh, your budget's $20 billion. There's certainly $1 billion laying around you wouldn't miss. And not actually. And so we're always under pressure to be the ones with the big target. Cutting education is almost like a third rail. Can't do that. And so they got rid of some inflation. That was their big contribution. Like, oh my, how could you stand that? And every other target, if you looked at it, they're really little. We had $1.09 billion, a $2 billion impact on the programs over that amount of time. Hardly anybody has a thing where it's 1 for 2. You put $1 to education, you get $1. You buy some environment with $1. You cut $1, you spend $1. Here you cut $1, you lose 2. And that's really meaningful when it comes to our part, or cutting hospital funding, or any of that. So I hope that the sense that we had with the collaborative approach of this particular island of collaboration can continue. And through the course of the working group, which I wish would have been in public, by the way, sunshine is the greatest disinfectant of so much of this. And then people go like, what are you doing? Like, oh yeah, I guess it isn't a good idea. But so as we continue to collaborate, I think we can do our best to protect the people that need us so much, and keep that social contract going, that people all think we should look after grandma and their cousin Leo and all that. So.
Senator, you're known for your work in the human services arena, but you've authored other pieces of legislation this session. For example, one appropriating funds to stop the spread of the spongy moth, or one congratulating a Mankato Eagle Scout. So which has been your favorite piece of legislation this session?
Well, you can take joy in every one. Actually, I had fun with the e-bike bill. And so we redid there was e-bike rebates. And it took a lot of work, and it just landed on my desk. And so there was a program where you could get a $1,500 rebate on an e-bike if you just signed up. In 11 seconds, the money was gone. 1% of Minnesotans actually tried to get the e-bike voucher of the whole state. At 11 seconds it was spent. So we changed it up. And so we made it a program for low-income people with disabilities. And so now we reduced it to $750, and it's going to be a lottery. And so I'm kind of excited about that. And so some people don't have a car, or they just don't get around. And I was shopping at Aldi, and this guy in the aisle had an e-bike, and he had a little basket in the back, and he was shopping in the aisle with his e-bike. It's like, how about that? Anyway, so that was fun. And it's in the transportation bill, and it's going to move along. And 3,000 people with a disability that make of modest income are going to get an e-bike. So that was pretty cool.
That is. Thank you, Senator. It's been a pleasure having you here.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me, and keep up the good work.
You too, sir.